Morning, all. It's about time to get into position. How you doing, kitty? You doing all right? All right, let's get started. So we got 4 games tonight in the NHL, and we got some news of the day to talk about as well. So let's get into it. Starting with Boston and Pittsburgh, which starts in roughly 2 hours at 3 p.m. Eastern, noon Pacific. The Boston Bruins and Pittsburgh Penguins has been an interesting battle this year. Boston's won 4 out of 6. The last meeting was a 7-5 win for Boston. That was in Boston. One of those games that's fun to watch as a fan, but one that'll drive you nuts if you're a coach. For the Bruins, they're 6 points behind Washington, 5 points behind Pittsburgh, and 3 points behind the Islanders. For the suddenly potentially first place Penguins, they're only 1 point behind Washington, 3 ahead of the Islanders, and 5 ahead of Boston. So if Boston were to say win this one in overtime or shootout, it just tightens up the race even more. So, or if it was a 3-point game either way, right? So we'll see how things go between the two of them today. And then 3 hours later at 6 Eastern, 3 Pacific, we've got the Philadelphia Flyers at home to the New Jersey Devils. The 14, 27, and 6 New Jersey Devils, of course, it's been a bit of a slog for New Jersey fans to sit through lately. But for Philadelphia fans, it hasn't been much better. 21, 19, and 7, and they've just kind of meandered their way out of the playoff race at all. Philly's won 2 out of 3 between these two teams so far this year. Their last meeting was a 4-3 win for New Jersey in Philadelphia. So we'll see how things go today, also in Philadelphia. New Jersey is out. Philadelphia's 11 points back. So they're mathematically alive, but not really. It's also at 6 o'clock Eastern, 3 o'clock Pacific. We've got Buffalo and the Rangers. Everything's early today. For Buffalo, they're 13, 28, and 7. They're 1 point behind New Jersey. We'll see if they can pass New Jersey today, right? For the Rangers, 24, 18, and 6. The Rangers can't take anything lightly or for granted right now because they're not likely to make the playoffs. They've played 2 more games than Boston, but if Boston were to lose in Pittsburgh, which is possible, and the Rangers were to beat Buffalo, also possible, they would pull within 4 points of the Boston Bruins. So again, it's not likely that they catch Boston, but they're closer than Philly. New York Rangers have won 4 out of 6, so they have 2 more left against Buffalo, including this one today. Their last meeting was a 3-2 win for Buffalo in a shootout, which was in Buffalo. And of course, Buffalo's out of the playoffs. So there you go. And then at 7 o'clock Eastern, 4 o'clock Pacific, the only game of the day that doesn't involve an Eastern matchup is a Central matchup between Columbus and Tampa. Columbus is kind of due for a win, right? They kind of have to. Can't lose out the rest of the season, right? And so for Tampa, who are 31, 14, and 2, seeing 15, 25, and 9 Columbus, Tampa's been kind of all over the map too when it comes to consistency. So if you're looking for an upset today, I personally would think why not Columbus? Korpisalo's starting. Korpisalo's numbers have been kind of ugly lately, but again, they're due for a good game. And Tampa Bay's won 4 out of 7, which means they've lost 3 out of 7 against Columbus. So this is their last meeting. Maybe Columbus manages to have one really good game based on Elvis venting his frustrations after their last loss. And yeah, that was their last game, which was a 3-1 win for Tampa at home. Tampa Bay is 4 points behind Carolina. They're 3 points behind Florida. They need to keep winning. Carolina and Florida are going to keep getting points. Tampa Bay needs to keep up with them. So there you go. Those are your 4 games for today. Now, interesting news from last night. Artem Anisimov was actually the next in line to play in net if Hogberg had been hurt for the Ottawa Senators. So in the warm-up, they lose Anton Forsberg. During the game, they lose Matt Murray. So they're down to number 3, which is Hogberg, and Anisimov would have been next up. Apparently he had the equipment. He was all set to go if called upon. That would have been the weirdest thing we've seen in hockey in a very long time. And I mean, as weird as emergency backup goaltenders are, how bizarre would it be to see a guy in net that's not a goalie? So yeah, that would have been weird. So doesn't happen, but at some point May see it. Just imagine if that happens in a playoff game. We end up with this just rash of injuries, and you end up with, and in net tonight for the St. Louis Blues, Ryan O'Reilly. We had no idea. So, Mark Scheifele, there's a big deal being made about the fact that he was benched for 17 minutes of the game last night, and Paul Maurice is sending a message. And honestly, when this happens, A, I agree with the coach and their right to bench players to send a message, and B, I don't think it's that big a deal. Scheifele's been a Jet for a very, very long time. He's a good player. He's a point-a-game guy. And, you know, being benched is part of being a sports athlete. They all go through it, every sport. Like, I want to say hockey player, but happens in basketball. It happens, you know, football. This guy hasn't been out for a while. Why? Well, he dropped that one pass, so, you know, they're going to look at his backup. But again, you know, media will make a big deal about it. There's headlines splashed everywhere about Scheifele being benched. I think it's fine. Do it now. We're about a month away from the playoffs in the North. Do it now. Make sure these guys are all, you know, getting the message. And for the Jets, you have to have some concern if you're Paul Maurice that maybe they're losing a step. You look at that back-to-back set with the Toronto Maple Leafs. And Toronto definitely had a fire there. There was something there that Winnipeg didn't really match as well. So we'll see. We'll see how things go for Winnipeg. But it is interesting to me how, depending on where somebody gets benched, there might be a bunch of talk about it. But, like, you know, just coming from a place where I watch as much hockey as possible, it really isn't that unusual for players to get benched. It's just some markets get way more attention for it than others. Tyler Toffoli, Montreal Canadiens, said that Tatar came into the game last night banged up, couldn't finish it. Montreal, of course, is in a cap situation, which is messing with the lineup. So with all these injuries, they still don't have cap space for emergency call-ups. Basically, in order for them to bring in Caulfield, they'd have to send Primo down and bring in Lindgren. It's kind of a mess. And like with emergency call-up situations and cap and everything, Montreal is kind of in trouble. And it's interesting because Montreal shouldn't be in trouble. We shouldn't be talking about this. We shouldn't see comments on the channel from Flames fans going, oh, now I've got hope. Right. And Vancouver as well has to be looking at this and going, shame about the team. Be a shame if somebody came and took your playoff spot. So, yeah, I mean, Montreal, it's kind of just flipped over the last few weeks. 3 weeks ago, nobody would have said, well, their playoff spot might end up in trouble. Nobody would have thought that. And yet, here we are. So, we'll see if Tatar's injury changes things the way they do the lineup, but there are some lineup issues with the Montreal Canadiens. Now, NHL scheduling. So next year's schedule, and I've seen people for years say we need the conference playoffs back. So NHL teams, and it sounds like it's going to be a vote where the NHL is going to make a decision, and all 32 teams, you have to think, are going to have a say in this. How are we going to do the scheduling for next year? And I talked about that in a video, right? And it sounds like the decision that they're going to go with could very well end up being very NBA-like. Or it could be something that's very different. So, there are two scenarios for how the schedule is going to work. In the first version, you have home and homes versus the other conference. You have East and West, right? And so you play home and home against everybody. You play 3 against the other division. And then you play either 4 or 3 against everybody in your own division. Now, in that scenario, you're looking at a conference playoffs. 1 versus 8, 2 versus 7, 3 versus 6, etc. In that scenario, you're going to get the fairest result. I agree on that. You're also not going to have a lot in the way of rivalries until the playoffs. You're going to have teams that see each other at most 4 times. So over an 82-game schedule, that's once every 20-some games. So that's once every, 6-7 weeks? So that's where things would be completely different. And this is why when people said, I don't want it to be the same next year, they will never do this again. This year's schedule is absolutely a unique one-off. It's never going to happen again. But the second scenario they're looking at would bring in division playoffs for sure. So we would end up with division playoffs. But we have home and home with the other three divisions. So that's where it's different. It's the other three divisions you have home and home with. And then you have against your division 4 games each, and that leaves you with 6 games left over. So those 6 games you can schedule against. Vancouver could be against Toronto as an example. Calgary against Montreal could be an example. It leaves room there for owners to say, okay, so this is the way to maximize our return here. What's the biggest gate that we can have? So certain teams in the U.S. might be like, okay, we'd like to have a Boston game in there. So it could be interesting for that reason, and see who they end up bringing in as your 6 leftover special games, right? Division playoffs would be likely in that situation, which again shouldn't bother anybody, because it's not like this year where it's going to be you see every team 8 times and you're going to see the same teams in the first 2 rounds. Again, it's a 1 year, it's a one-off, it's never going to happen again. But the interesting thing with that second scenario is that would eliminate conferences. You don't have a conference. You're playing home and home against all the other divisions. So what that could do is it could set it up so that when you reach the semifinals, where there's 4 teams left, you can seed 1 through 4. And you could end up with any 2 teams that emerge ending up against each other in the finals. You could have really unpredictable Stanley Cup finals, and that could be fascinating. So you could end up with a Boston, New York Islanders Stanley Cup final as an example. You could end up with a LA Kings, Colorado Avalanche Stanley Cup final, because they're in different divisions, right? So yeah, I think that would be interesting. And yeah, that's why I have in black no conferences, because it was Elliot Friedman that talked about all this, so I have that in blue. I'm looking at this and saying, so there wouldn't be any conferences then. We wouldn't have an East and West. We would just have 4 divisions. And so there's definitely, I think, benefits to that. And we'll see what they do. But yeah, that should be interesting. So let me know which scenario you approve of more, 1 or 2. Let me know what you guys think. All right, Pettersson. Pettersson is likely out for the season. I should change that. So the way they're talking about it sounds like he's done. That they wanted to see progression from him, but they really haven't. So he's likely out for the season. It's probably done for him. And it's odd, because in the beginning the injury was, well, it's day to day. Well, it's, I don't know. He's probably okay. And then it was, oh, him. Yeah, he's on long-term injured reserve. He's, yeah. He should be back, though. And now it's, so it makes me a little nervous that this might be one of those nagging issues, and hopefully he's going to be okay to start next season, right? And it'll be interesting, too, to see if that affects how much money he gets as a restricted free agent this year. So, yeah, we'll see what happens. Chris Johnston also reported last night on Hockey Night in Canada that Fox Sports is kind of emerging as the network that could get the second part of that TV deal in the United States. And that's really curious to me, because Fox Sports, I've watched all the regional Fox Sports networks become Bally's with that music, it's like the music for Bally's. It's, if you watch wrestling, basically it's the Finn Balor theme, but without any fun in it. I've realized what it reminds me of is the Finn Balor theme, and I'm like, oh, it's like that, but it's the Kirkland version of that. So that's there you go. All right. Yeah, so basically Fox Sports has kind of taken the lead above NBC. And my first thought with that was, so if Fox Sports got the contract and NBC lost it, what happens to guys like Patrick Sharp? What happens to Catherine Tappan? What happens to all the people who are employed with NBC that we see on there all the time? Did they end up going over to Fox Sports? What happens? So yeah, that's interesting. And apparently Apple is involved as well, Apple TV. And that would probably be something involving streaming, right? So it's interesting. We'll see if that does end up going to Fox Sports. Chris Johnston, again, saying he's heard from multiple sources that they've kind of taken the lead for that second part of the TV contract. ESPN got the main part. If Fox Sports gets the second chunk of that schedule, that could be really, really interesting. That could completely change the sport in the U.S. in terms of how it's covered and what kind of exposure it has. So it'd be interesting because I would be interesting to see if Fox Sports holding it would mean that the Fox network would be broadcasting games as well. So all right, again, it's about getting as many eyeballs watching hockey as possible in the States, right? In Canada, we've already got it. Like over 1 million people watching a hockey game, covered, no problem. States, it can be more of a challenge. So it's about finding the right partners, the right networks, and yeah, the fact too that there's still discussions means there's probably still a bidding process going on. It'll be interesting to see how much that package goes for. So news from this morning, Riley Stillman has signed a 3-year extension worth $1.35 million per season with the Chicago Blackhawks. I'm going to take a moment and appreciate it. I didn't say Corey Stillman. But yeah, Stillman signs that extension. Keep in mind you're going to see extensions between now and July where fans are going to go, I wonder why. Now, players will want to hold on to, teams will want to hold on to players and have that cap certainty. And B, they'll also want to have players that meet the exposure agreements. In Vancouver, that's Madison Bowie. That's why they picked him up, because that meets an expansion requirement that they expose him in the expansion draft. That's one of the required players. So yeah, for Stillman, 3 years, $1.35 million, and so the Chicago Blackhawks have decided to keep him around. He hasn't played there very long, so he must have made a pretty good impression. Or their pro scouts basically won the organization over that this guy's going to be it, man. Yeah, so 3 years, $1.35 million. Not too bad for a guy who's been mostly a third pairing defenseman. And here's something interesting too. So Pierre LeBrun reporting yesterday, Sarah Siv had reported that Nedeljkovic was playing last night, and he said that 4 more starts for Nedeljkovic would change his status at the end of the season from an unrestricted free agent to a restricted free agent. The unrestricted free agency kicks in for some players if they're not appearing in enough games. I think it's just basically if you're buried in an organization that it's easier to become an unrestricted free agent so you can get out of it. That's always the way I've looked at it. So the fact that if Nedeljkovic starts, I would assume now it's 3 more games from here, he becomes a restricted free agent instead of unrestricted. That's because then, he's actually making progressions for the organization. But it'll be interesting to see how Carolina manages this because they're in a race for first. The good news is Nedeljkovic is worthy of getting all the starts that he's getting. So it's not like they're starting a guy that's submarining their hopes at winning the division. But that is interesting. That was an interesting one. Cap Friendly is going to be busy in the offseason. Not as busy as Cap Friendly's been during the season with the amount of movement going on between teams, taxi squads, and their AHL franchises. I mean, they've basically just got to have like a giant corkboard in their room and just a bunch of yarn all over the place and pictures of every player. There's got to be some kind of craziness going on with them right now because it's hard to follow who's getting brought up and who's getting dropped down and who's debuting here and debuting there. So yeah, we'll definitely in the off season likely have a look and say, oh, this guy was going to be UFA, but now he's not. In cases like Nedeljkovic. All right, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.